Christians, stop claiming that you can prove the resurrection. The resurrection is the most important event in the Christian story. The Apostle Paul goes as far as to say if the resurrection isn't true, then Christianity is in vain. And yet, the resurrection has no historical proof. We have some testimonies of early Christians written down in the New Testament, but beyond their testimonies, there is no archaeological, historical, or scientific evidence that the resurrection actually happened. Now, this doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It doesn't mean that we should say that it's false. Instead, we should admit that it is something we believe by faith. We have faith in the risen Christ. We have faith that 3 days after Christ was crucified, he rose from the dead and his disciples witnessed him, and it changed their lives and changed the world forever. I believe in the resurrection. I believe Christ is alive, but I also acknowledge that I cannot prove it and don't feel the need to have to prove it. Christianity isn't a religion of certainty. It's a religion of faith. It's a religion of personal experience encountering Jesus Christ. Every evangelist invites people to open their hearts to God, to experience the love of God. And it's that experience of the love of God in the risen Christ that transforms our hearts, not our ability to be able to prove something happened in history. So stop making this claim that you can prove the resurrection. Stop saying that the resurrection is verifiably true, because it's quite simply not. And making those claims actually turns more people away from the faith, because all it takes is a simple Google search to see there is no external sources beyond the Bible that claim that the resurrection actually happened or verify that it actually happened. It's not provable, but it is something people can experience. So instead of trying to prove people that the resurrection happened in history, let's invite people to experience the love and the power of the risen Christ here and now.
Is that really true? Is it really true that there's no evidence for the resurrection? The last program that we aired gave evidence for the resurrection. And this week, we're going to analyze a little bit more thoroughly the evidence for the resurrection. Unfortunately, there was also a debate during the week leading up to Easter, Holy Week. And we're going to look at that debate as well. Here on Consider This, welcome, I'm Travis Campbell. I am the president and founder of Consider This, an organization that's dedicated to the defense of classical Christianity. And we have a lot to talk about. So I'm going to bring in my good friend. Here's Richard. How you doing, Richard?
Doing well.
I asked you to watch the debate between Bart Ehrman and Justin Brierley. I take it you did that?
Indeed.
All right. Well, I'm going to show a clip or two, and we're going to respond, and then we'll just take it from there. This debate occurred on the Unbelievable show, Justin Brierley. And one of the things that I have to say, if you've not watched any of the debates on his show, this is sort of the standard show. An apologist has arrived if that apologist is able to defend their beliefs on the Justin Brierley radio show / the podcast. He's got a huge following. He's a British broadcaster, and he's probably the most even-handed host that you can have. I mean, he really does welcome his guests. He really does try to moderate well. And so we're going to watch a few clips here.
Okay. What I've been saying is Peter did not claim that the Messiah got raised from the dead the second he saw Jesus. What he thought was Jesus had come back to life.
You're saying he figured it out as an apocalyptic Jew. I'm going with your argument, yeah. But Paul, how does Paul imagine?
Right, I was getting to that.
Crucified man.
I was getting to that.
Rising from the dead.
I just had to stop and say this is not how you treat a debate opponent. I think Bart Ehrman started. I lost count. I think I stopped at 4. I'm pretty sure there were more sentences. And I don't think he completed a single one.
No.
So this is not good. This is not, and we're not starting at the beginning, but this is not a good start.
No.
So I'm taking a deep breath and I'm about to plunge back in. You want to say anything, Richard?
I just yeah. That's basically all I want to say is Justin Bass doesn't even, he's trying to anticipate his arguments and then cutting him off before he can make his arguments. You can't do that.
Yeah, now I would have sat patiently and listened to Bart tell me what he said and then responded to it. But for those of you that have not read Bart Ehrman's literature, Bart Ehrman does believe in the appearances. He believes that the appearances are a fact of history. And just to back up a little bit, last week when I aired our program, what I did is I put together a string of programs that I did with Fuz Rana over at Reasons to Believe, where I presented 10 facts about Jesus that all or nearly all scholars agree to, and that those facts provide adequate inductive grounds, as people like William Lane Craig would say, for showing that the resurrection is the best explanation of the known facts. So when Brandon Robertson says you can't prove the resurrection, I agree with that. You cannot prove any historical claim in the same way you would prove a scientific theorem or a mathematical formula. But you can reason to the best explanation of the evidence, as long as there are shared facts that we all hold in common. Say something.
I also kind of to get back to Brandon Rogers a little bit.
It's Robertson.
Robinson, I mean. I apologize.
No,
he says Christianity is not a religion of certainty, that it's a matter of faith. But if we believe the Bible, what faith is being certain of what we hope for, or sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. So by his own definition, if he says that Christianity is a religion of faith, it is a religion of certainty.
And here's another way to put it. Christianity is a religion of faith. It's also a religion of hope. And hope, it translates the Greek word elpis, which means confidence. So we have confidence that these things are so.
Mm-hmm.
True. A true Christian could come in with a very weak faith, but God in His grace offers us assurances. And one way to gain assurance is to look at the evidence for the resurrection. We'll talk about Robertson a little bit more, but I will say, I hope everybody noticed that he says, I believe in the resurrection. I believe that Christ is alive. Now, we all need to appreciate where progressive Christianity comes from. Progressive Christians, as a general rule, do not believe that the resurrection is an event that occurred in space-time history. They don't believe that there was actually an empty tomb where Christ actually rose from the dead. Robertson was mentored by John Dominic Crossan, who notoriously and infamously said that when Christ died, his corpse was taken off of the cross and buried in a shallow grave and eaten by a pack of wild dogs. And yet Crossan will say, I believe that I take the resurrection by faith. So Crossan doesn't really believe that the resurrection happened. And if Robertson is anything like his mentor, I'm willing to bet that when he said what he said, he didn't mean what you were thinking he meant. He meant that Christ is alive in some ethereal, non-factual way. Christ is alive probably metaphorically. Maybe he can flesh out what he means by that, Jesus being alive, but he doesn't really believe that the resurrection is a fact of history. So of course you can't prove it, and not that I would even say you could anyway, because it didn't happen. It didn't actually happen as a fact of history. And he's right. Non-Christians are turned off when Christians give bad arguments for the resurrection. And I think you and I are both agreed that Justin Bass, who wrote this book, this is Bedrock, and it's called The Bedrock of Christianity. It's a scholarly, albeit layman's level. It's got scholarship behind it, but it is for the layperson, giving them a foundation for how they can defend the resurrection. It's a good book. Unfortunately, Bass doesn't defend himself well against the likes of Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is showing himself to be superior already in our clip, and we're going to have to trudge through some more. But go ahead. Yeah, I know you want to say something.
Well, it's just, it's just going to get worse, right? This is just the beginning, but
It's just
yeah, I'm glad to know that his book is better than his performance in the debate, because I have not read it, for full disclosure.
Yeah, and I guess I have to take this time to say I'm going to say some good things. So he's a brother in Christ. He believes the resurrection. He's given good evidence for it in his writings. And I have to appreciate the fact that I've never been in a formal debate. So I have to say full disclosure here. I've never been in a formal debate. I'm not unwilling to get engaged in that kind of forum. But, anybody can Monday morning quarterback after a debate like we're doing. Mike Tyson once said, every boxer has a plan of attack until he gets hit in the face. And Bass is getting hit in the face a few times. And I think he's unraveling here in a lot of ways.
I think it's also worth noting that he does appear to have a active missionary, do active missionary work in Jordan or Lebanon.
Yeah.
Lebanon, I believe. So
Which
that is very commendable.
They're very commendable. So, yes. All right, let's get back to the fray here.
Persecuting Christians before he ever met Peter and James. So he knows the Christian claims already. There have been a lot of psychological analyses about what might have happened to somebody who feels guilt over what they're doing to these people that would generate a vision and to have a conversion. As you probably know, there are instances in which people who are enemies of Christ have visions in which they get converted. And so Paul would be in that category.
Yeah.
Okay.
But again, Sundar Singh, by the way, would be a great example of this. This was an Indian that became a great missionary. He was burning Bibles. He was persecuting Christians in the early 1900s. And ultimately, he had a vision of Jesus, and he was transformed like Paul. But again, that happened after the Christian claim has already been made.
Yes, so did Paul. So did Paul.
Yeah.
That's my point. It's exactly the same. So you can't say that it doesn't happen to enemies.
So you think he understood
because you just gave the example of an enemy where it happened.
So you think he understood the Christian claim clearly as he was persecuted?
He understood that they were saying Jesus got raised from the dead. Absolutely.
Okay. And then
why else is he persecuted?
And then he imagined on the Damascus Road.
I didn't say he imagined anything on the Damascus Road.
Well, what happened on the Damascus Road?
I just said that there are lots of options and we don't know because he doesn't tell us.
Well, he said he saw the Lord Jesus. That's what he said.
He said he saw the Lord Jesus. But where did he see him? When did he see him? How did he see him? How close was he? Did they talk? Did they spend a week together?
Seeing him's good enough, right?
He thought he saw Jesus. I've been saying that all along. He thought he saw Jesus.
I'm not expecting.
I'm asking why you don't believe him. Why do you think Paul's wrong?
Why don't I think a person got raised from the dead?
Yes.
Oh,
why don't you think Jesus got raised from the dead?
I don't think anybody gets raised from the dead. Okay. Because it violates the laws of nature.
Okay.
I mean,
so you have the kind of a materialist, fundamentalist view.
Well, let me ask this. You think God raised Jesus from the dead, right? Do you think God can break the laws of mathematics? Can God
can't contradict himself? No. Because he is
exactly.
Mathematics is his language.
That's right. The other language he uses is physics. Can he break the laws of physics?
I mean, I think we're getting off.
No, we are not. This is precisely. You asked me why I don't believe it.
Well,
and the reason I don't believe it is because it violates the laws of physics. And I don't think
God
can
feed things into his system. For sure.
I don't think God can break the law of physics any more than he can break the law of mathematics.
Okay. Yeah, we have to stop and address this. This is the issue. Ehrman is right. Bass is wrong. Bass lost this round. This is the issue. Go ahead.
Well, there are so many ways that Bass could have answered this, right? But he doesn't choose any of them, right? Like, he could say, like Ehrman says, well, can God break the laws of physics? Well, if you believe in an all-powerful God that's outside of time, then of course he can break at least one law of physics just from the virtue of being outside of time.
Right. Bass suffers. Okay, I'm gonna back up a little bit. There is a long-standing debate between evidentialists and presuppositionalists and classicalists. Now, I did a series of videos with Vajrana breaking down these approaches to apologetics. A presuppositionalist says that we start with the Bible's claim to be inspired as a precondition for rationality. I reject that claim. I do not believe that the Bible is a precondition for rationality. And I do fear that my presuppositional friends are just begging all sorts of questions. And when you start with that claim, you're always going to come across as being question begging to your interlocutors. And for the few years that I was a Van Tillian presuppositionalist, had a really hard time conveying the Van Tillian apologetic to non-believers without them sort of snickering. I mean, it was just, okay, so you're saying that the Bible that was written long after human beings began to think is a precondition for human rationality. It's a product of human rationality. And I would say, well, no, it's a product of God. Well, how do you know that? Because it's a precondition for human rationality. And now it's not a transcendental circle, as they say. It's a vicious circle. When you see Van Tillian apologists out on the street defending the faith using the presuppositional arguments, another problem that they don't really seem to appreciate is that, in my library right here, I have a stack of essays just on transcendental arguments that I haven't even gotten to yet. But I can tell you that in some of them, they're saying that transcendental argumentation is really, they're reporting to their readers, these philosophers who are experts in this area, they're reporting to the readers that this is a form of argumentation that is largely defunct. That it's not a form of argumentation you get a whole lot of mileage out of. There are some qualifications that you can use there. But at the end of the day, the idea that you can demonstrate that an entire canon of Scripture, the Protestant canon, mind you, not the Catholic, not the Greek Orthodox, not the Ethiopian, the Protestant canon of Scripture is the precondition for human thinking, is a huge leap in logic. And nobody is going to take you seriously. So as I've listened to Van Tillians over the years, glibly laugh at the classical theistic proofs. It's really easy to laugh at somebody's apologetic, and then you stand up and you give an account. And when they do that, you shrug your shoulders and say, well, first of all, Van Til himself never fully articulated the argument. It is used very successfully by Greg Bonson in his famous debate with Gordon Stein back in the mid 80s. And it's almost like all the Van Tillians that are at least out on the street are just ringing the changes of that great successful debate without appreciating the fact that a lot of people don't think that Greg Bonson even used a transcendental argument in that debate. He used what we would call an argument. It's called demonstratio quia. It's reasoning from consequence to grounds. So there are laws of logic. There must be a mind behind them and so forth.
Okay, yeah.
So as far as I'm concerned, and by the way, I have my students listen to that debate because it does show how irrational atheism is and can be. So because everybody agrees that Bonson won that debate, it's just that none of us can agree on exactly how he pulled it off. It's just one of those things where glib Gordon Stein was completely undressed in that debate. But what he did is he proved that atheism is false. He didn't prove that Christianity is true. And those are two distinct issues. All right. Now, the evidentialists are on the other wing of this whole camp. The evidentialist says, and you have two groups of those, what we would call traditional evidentialists, the Palian McGrewian, after Lydia and Tim McGrew. So the McGrews are currently living scholars. I admire them very much. They are resurrecting William Paley's old case for Christianity. William Paley wrote a very famous book called Natural Theology. in the early 1800s, but about 10 years before that, he wrote his A View to the Evidences of Christianity, where he outlined his case for Christianity. And what they're doing is they're resurrecting this. And people that are in this line of thought would be people like John Warwick Montgomery, and then the McGrews and others. And then John McClatchy is on this team. He's Team McGrew. And what they're doing is they're trying to say, look, you need to first, they call it the maximal data approach. You need to give a whole network of intimate and very long-winded proofs that the New Testament can be trusted as a historical document. And then on that basis, you can say very quickly, the disciples were either lying, they were deceived, or they were telling the truth. Mm-hmm. And the New Testament document's historicity shows that they were not lying, and they were in a position to know the truth, and therefore they were telling the truth. Now, that's an argument that I resonate with, because I think that the New Testament is historically trustworthy. Mm-hmm. I think that I don't think that the disciples were lying. And so I think a lot of the material that they're giving me is very, very good. However, people like Ehrman, they're atheists. Mm-hmm. And by definition, a New Testament that records miracles is unreliable. Mm-hmm. How do you know that the New Testament is unreliable? Because it has miracles.
Yeah, that's basically Ehrman's argument here.
Yeah, people can't walk on water. Mm-hmm. Now, and I will say, there was a day, and like take Michael Martin. Michael Martin wrote a book called The Case Against Christianity. In that book, Michael Martin entertains some ideas coming out of the 18th century. And some of the deists of that day, to debunk the miracles of Jesus, just to give one example, how do we explain Jesus walking on water? Well, maybe Jesus balanced himself on some floating wood. That's stupid. That's crazy. He didn't balance himself on floating wood. The current Christ mythicists, the current skeptics, have a very easy answer to the question, how do you explain Jesus walking on water? He didn't. Mm. There was no wood, and there was no Jesus to walk on water. That's what the mythicists say. And even those who like Ehrman, think that there was an historical Jesus, that story about Jesus just didn't happen. Mm. It's not like it's an event that someone colored with a miracle. It's just not an event. It didn't happen. Mark inherited a tradition and put it in his gospel. Was Mark being sincere? Yes. Did Mark think he was telling the truth? Yes. Was he lying? No. Was he telling the truth? No. It's very simple. Okay. And why do the atheists believe this? Because God doesn't exist. And if God doesn't exist, God cannot perform a miracle. Because last I checked, you have to exist before you can do anything. Mm-hmm. And so here's what happens. There's another group of evidentialists led by Team Habermas and Lacona and others. And William Lane Craig is closely in line with this. He's distanced himself from calling himself a minimal facts proponent. But they say, we want to take facts that are recognized as facts by the broad mainstream of scholars and even show through the evidence that these facts are valid and use those facts as adequate inductive grounds for inferring the resurrection. And that's actually the case that I made for the resurrection in those videos. I was following the Craig Habermas Lacona pattern.
Yes, I remember when you that's the one that you taught me.
Yeah, and I've used this for years. Now, Lydia McGrew wrote an essay a few years ago that made me sincerely doubt this, and I've been rethinking a lot of it. Here's the problem with the minimal facts approach. Craig, for example, has said that you don't need to make any kind of argument for the New Testament's reliability in giving this argument. Even if the New Testament is largely untrustworthy, it can be shown to have some facts with a kernel of truth in them. Now, here's the problem. Most atheists are going to agree that even the Christ mythicists who will say that Jesus never even existed and that the genre of the Gospels is myth, they're going to grant that there are kernels of historical information in there. For crying out loud, Spider-Man has historical information in it. But nobody says that Spider-Man is, an historical documentary or anything like that. So you can find works of fiction, even works of fiction can have historical facts and historical verisimilitude in them.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem with Craig and Habermas and Lacona, not Craig as much as Habermas and Lacona, but they think that you can just show just that there's this fact, like Paul had an appearance, Jesus appeared to him, and you can use that as a known fact from which you can infer a resurrection. It doesn't work that way. Ehrman, for example, believes that the appearances are true, but he doesn't believe in group appearances. He doesn't think that Jesus appeared to groups. He thinks that Jesus only appeared to individuals like Paul. And if he's right about that, that is not enough information from which we can construct a good argument for the resurrection. That's just, and what you want to say to the evidentialists is, if you don't think that God exists, if they don't think that God exists, why think that they're going to be impressed with an argument for a resurrection? They don't have the cognitive framework. They don't have the background knowledge. They don't have the worldview by which you can assess such evidence.
Yeah. So that's why you have to go back to the sources.
Right.
And
but this is where you have the evidentialists here and the presuppositionalists here, and they're bickering with each other about method, and the world is laughing.
Mm-hmm.
Because the world's like, Bart and Ehrmans of this world are not prepared to infer a resurrection, which by definition is a miracle, an act of God, if you don't think that there's a God who can act.
Yeah. So in a sense, the presuppositionalists are correct.
Their diagnosis of the method is absolutely correct. When Van Til attacks the evidentialists for wrongly thinking that facts are self-interpreting, he's right about that. There are some facts that I think are self-interpreting in the sense that I can just look at it and know its significance apart from my worldview. For example, the laws of logic. I mean, I can't get around those, and I can know that they are ontologically valid. And I don't need a worldview to know that I exist and that I am contingent, that I can not exist. I can know that apart from a worldview. But when it comes to the facticity of something, like an atheist could in principle agree that the tomb was empty. Bart Ehrman is one of those who doesn't. So in my presentation, when I said that the fact of the empty tomb is recognized by the majority of scholars, I wasn't lying. But that doesn't change the fact that there are some scholars who disagree with it, that there are some scholars who say it's not a fact. Well, Ehrman's one of them. Mm-hmm. But let's say that Ehrman concluded that the tomb was found empty. That wouldn't get you to the resurrection. You still have to argue for that. Mm-hmm. So there are some facts that you can accept regardless of worldview. You can accept the facts of the appearances, right? In and of itself, that wouldn't prove that the resurrection happened. The empty tomb, the sincere faith of the disciples. These are all facts that you can accept as a matter of principle. And then the rational thing for the atheist to do is just to remain agnostic as to how to explain them.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's what Ehrman appears to do. So
how do you break this horn? Enter the classical apologist. Mm-hmm. The classical apologist says, before you even open your Bible, you need to set forth a rich natural theology, a knowledge of God derived from nature, utilizing the canons of reason. And by showing that there is a God, you have removed the prior improbability of a resurrection. And if you have a rich natural theology, which includes things like God created the universe out of nothing, God pre-designed the preconditions for life, that would be the anthropic principle, the fine-tuning of the universe, that God clearly entered into space and time and created the very first life. This is not inconsistent with evolution or anything, but Darwin himself at the end of The Origin of Species said that God created first life. So these would be things that you could argue for, and there are people that do argue for that not only remove the prior improbability of a resurrection, but even show the prior probability that God is willing to perform a miracle. And that sets up your background knowledge so that when you finally open the New Testament, I think that the maximal data people are correct. That you don't have to show in detail that the New Testament is historically trustworthy, like all the nuts and bolts. But you can show that in broad terms, we have a basically reliable text. Its preservation in terms of the archaeological finds that have verified it and so forth. And then we have these facts that almost all scholars hold in common. And with a person like Ehrman, I would simply say, well, then let's talk about what we don't have in common. Let's talk about the burial tradition. Why do you think that the burial tradition is not true? Bass doesn't do that.
No. And another thing I think that he could do is he could look at Ehrman, because Ehrman, I think we skipped over some of his examples of like, well, there are all these people who have seen these strange things.
We're about to get to it. We're about to show the other miracle claims, and we can talk about that in just a minute.
Yeah, we can talk about that. So I'll save that for later. But I will still say that Bass should have then, like, as soon as Ehrman was like, as soon as Ehrman is like, well, it's impossible for example for God to do miracles. To get back to that point, let's get back to that point since we're going to do the witnesses later. He should have gone, well, if you're saying you don't know what they saw, right? You're not sure what they saw, and you're saying it's impossible for it to be the being that they thought they saw. Doesn't that mean you are in fact? And I hate to go, but I think presuppositional is the only way you can respond to this particular point. Is you aren't even granting that it's possible that they saw what they saw, and if they saw what they said they saw, then there is an infinite God who exists outside of the laws of physics, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is how you could reason, at least just setting up the possibilities. If they saw what they said they saw, then there really is a God who transcends the laws of physics and is able to suspend them.
And I would also say that Bass should have gone to his sources and said, well, we have all of these other examples of people witnessing these things. And also we have other examples of miracles, both in the Bible and out. I would even say you can go outside the Bible. We have things that people can't explain that there are lots of witnesses to.
Sure. Well, I mean, here, like, when Bass said, well, we're getting beyond the question. No, we're not. Bart Ehrman was right. We're not getting beyond the issue, because the issue is he asked them in the question, why don't you think that the resurrection happened?
Yeah, and I could not believe that he said we're getting beyond the question. I just didn't have an answer prepared.
And Ehrman said, well, I don't believe that miracles happen. I don't believe God can't break the laws of mathematics, and he can't break the laws of physics. And I would simply say, if you can give me proof that the laws of physics are necessary, that they're necessary truths and they're not contingent, then you would have a good point. But the laws of physics can be different. We can conceive of universes with a different set of physical laws. We can even conceive of universes, and this is exactly what the fine-tuning of the universe is all about. Life-permitting universes are far less plausible or far less probable than life-prohibiting universes are far more probable than life-permitting universes. And the analogy would be like, conceptually speaking, if the laws of physics were off just by a little bit, then there would be no life. And so the laws of physics have to fit a very narrow range for life to even be possible in any universe. And so it's like the analogy that's given is, imagine a big vat full of billions and billions and billions and billions of balls. They're all colored black. And for every so billion, there's one. For every billion, there's just one white ball, right? So clearly, the black balls just outnumber the white balls. Now, imagine that you walk up to this vat and you're able to stick your hand in and pull out a ball randomly. Well, any ball that you pull out is equally possible. I mean, in other words, when you first stick your hand in, for all you know, it's just any ball, right? Mm-hmm. But the fact that you're going to pull out a black ball is gargantuanly. I mean, it's just like tremendous.
It's impossible to pull a black ball almost. Yeah.
You're going to pull a black ball out and not pull a white ball out. Well, that's if you believe that the universe is the product of chance. That's exactly what you have to believe. Mm-hmm. That the universe popped into being uncaused out of nothing and just happened to have the laws of physics arranged the way they are. Now, if you appreciate this kind of argument, that means you have to believe that a cause that brought the universe into being, and when this cause brought the universe into being, designed the laws of physics. And as the designer of the laws of physics, this God can transcend them. Mm-hmm. So my answer to Ehrman would be yes, God can suspend the laws of physics to accomplish a purpose because they are not necessary in the same way that the laws of math are. That's why I can conceive of Luke Skywalker looking at a double sunset on Tatooine, even though the laws of physics dictate that he would be really, really sunburned.
Unless those stars had a very different heat signature, as it were.
Sure, but I mean, like any planet that we might out there that's rotating around two suns, that planet doesn't have life on it.
More than likely, yeah.
Yeah, we rule that planet out. That doesn't. A planet has to fit what we call the Goldilocks zone. It has to have a certain size. It has to be a certain distance from a main sequence star, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's you're adding these preconditions upon preconditions, and that's what makes the numbers so huge. Mm-hmm. And you can make. I mean, the simple answer is, well, I believe in a God who can transcends the laws of physics in a way that he doesn't transcend the laws of mathematics, because God is pure logic and he's never going to be illogical, and therefore he could never think that 2 + 2 = 5. But he creates the laws of physics and therefore transcends them and therefore can suspend them. Now, you're not going to be able to convince Bart Ehrman in a debate like that.
No, but you can at least answer his point.
You can answer his point and say, this is, well, okay, we're talking about worldviews here, and we're not really going to be able to assess that here. But my worldview is that there's a God who transcends physics and can suspend them. And there's nothing illogical about that. Now, it still might not be true. It may be false to assert that there is such a God, but such is logically possible. And it's you don't have to hit a home run every time you debate somebody. You can hit a few ground balls. And
it's actually kind of important that you establish what your differences are in a logical way,
right? Instead
of trying to avoid the question. Unfortunately,
Antony Flew said that given the facts that are shared in common by most New Testament scholars, that like the 10 that I went through, that it's reasonable for a Christian to believe that the resurrection happened. Now, that doesn't mean that it's reasonable for the non-Christian to be moved from non-belief to belief. So the Christian still has to make the case that the resurrection actually happened to the non-believer. But the very fact that there are these facts that everybody holds in common, it's kind of like a full stop moment for the Christian to reflect on the fact that, wait a minute, so many historians, so many New Testament scholars, even those that don't agree with me, think these facts are facts. That's pretty significant. That means that I'm pretty well within my rights. I, who already have faith, I'm well within my rights to keep believing in the resurrection, and that should be an encouragement. Mm-hmm. Shall we proceed?
Let's proceed.
All right. Here we go.
That the most probable event that happens with Jesus, because Paul and Peter said it happened, the most probable thing is the violation of a law of physics that has never been violated in 13.8 billion years. Never, except in this one instance. Well, now, if you're a historian, historians don't argue that something that happened only once in all of history is the most probable occurrence because somebody said it happened.
Unless there's an incredible evidence.
The incredible evidence is that Paul said
not just
so.
Not just that. We're just getting started.
What's interesting here for me, Bart, though, is that presumably, on the face of it, if you do believe that God would never, if there is a God, let's say, that God would never break the laws of physics, then on the faces of it, no amount of evidence could persuade you of a miraculous claim. You've kind of decided that before you come to the
you'd have
text.
to, what you'd
Is
have
that
to
fair?
do is you'd have to have evidence from physicists that these laws don't apply.
Okay, so you'd have to go to the physicist rather than
You
the
certainly could
historian.
prove it, because physicists
We need to go to the
have-
physicists for the evidence.
What
Well, if you're going to say that the laws of physics have been broken one time in the history of the human race, then you need pretty good evidence. And the evidence that somebody said they saw somebody
But
is
that's not the only
real.
evidence, and we're going to talk about more. But that's not the only evidence. We were talking about the appearances, and the appearances, I think, and you've said this, and I've appreciated you said this in how Jesus became God. You talk about how basically the evidence is consistent with if Jesus did rise from the dead, and I appreciate that, because you're saying if Jesus rose from the dead, basically the evidence we have looks the same. It would look the same. So you don't believe he rose from the dead, but the evidence does support the miracle. Do you agree with that?
No, of course I don't.
Well, okay, consistent with the miracle. Is it consistent with the miracle?
Let me put it this way. There's a famous Jewish holy man, Baal Shem Tov, who eyewitnesses have told us, lived in the 18th century. He told us he could heal the sick, he could cast out demons, he could raise the dead. We have eyewitness accounts of this. And my suspicion is that you don't think it really happened, because you'd be suspicious of those reports.
I think the fact that nobody outside of Hasidic Jews think it happened is quite
okay. Who outside of Christians think that Jesus was raised from the dead?
Pinchas Lapid. He was a Jewish historian and scholar.
I have to address this. This is maybe the one time that I think Bart Ehrman failed. And he didn't fail logically or anything like that. He won this debate. And he didn't fail because Bass said something that was surprising to him or overwhelming. But his laughter just dismissed the work of a very good New Testament scholar, Pinchas Lapid, who was Jewish. He died in around the year 2000. But he was an Orthodox Jew who didn't think that the New Testament was all that trustworthy. But he's an Abrahamic theist who believes that God performs miracles. He has a conceptual framework for believing this sort of thing.
Okay, I was wondering why Bart laughed. I assume that's why, because he doesn't consider him a serious historian.
Yeah, and he is a serious historian. He was one of four when he wrote his book on the resurrection. He was one of four Orthodox Jewish scholars in the world who was an expert in the New Testament. And he says in the book, before I started my research into this, I was a Sadducee. When it comes to the resurrection in general, I'm a Pharisee. When it came to the resurrection of Jesus, I was a Sadducee. Now, what he's doing, he's playing off of these groups that lived during Jesus' day, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Sadducees denied the resurrection. They did not believe that there was going to be a future resurrection of the faithful in the eschaton, in the end of time. They were sad, you see. And then you had the Pharisees who did think that the resurrection would happen at the end of time. And so he says, I was a Pharisee when it came to the resurrection in general, but I was a Sadducee when it came to the resurrection of Jesus. And then he studied the evidence and came to conclude that even though Jesus is not God incarnate and therefore Christianity is not true, nevertheless, the evidence for the resurrection is quite good. No one's talking proof. No one's talking, absolute certainty. We're not talking about that. We're talking about good historical evidence for the resurrection. And so I don't think that Ehrman had any right to just laugh that off. Bass is right. Who outside of the New Testament has studied the evidence and come to conclude that the resurrection happened? It's almost a trick question, because if you study the evidence and think that the resurrection happened, there's a pretty good chance you're going to convert to Christianity. Mm-hmm. And so it's very hard to come up with an example of someone who studies the evidence, believes the resurrection, and stays outside of the Christian community. And Pinchas Lapid just happens to be one of such a person, and that shouldn't be laughed off. That's actually quite significant. It's really hard to get people who are dedicated to an entire worldview to concede a rival worldview's chief miracle.
So I actually, so I study the Middle Ages, or I have studied the Middle Ages. One thing that's really interesting about medieval scholars is almost every one of them, no matter how secular they are, a lot of them are Roman Catholics, but a lot of them are secular, obviously. Almost every one of them has at least one miracle story that they aren't really
Yeah.
like sure about. Like most of the time they'll read hagiography and they'll be like, "Oh, this is obviously impossible." Right? Even everyone except for the most conservative Roman Catholics usually. But
Sure.
everyone has at least one example where they're like, the amount of evidence for this is really kind of overwhelming. Like, how do we get around this? And they're just not sure.
Right.
That doesn't mean obviously that they believed it happened.
Yeah.
But they're
right.
historians looking at the historical record and they're going, a common example is St. Francis of Assisi, right?
Mhm.
Because there were so many witnesses to the stigmata. A lot of historians believe that they actually existed and that he, like Ehrman, they're like he had some sort of experience and he had these wounds.
Yeah, and I'm like I wouldn't even taken the tack that Bass made here. Bass shows an immediate skepticism and an immediate dismissal of a possibility of a miracle that's outside of his faith tradition. And I don't understand why a Christian needs to be skeptical automatically of a miracle outside of his faith tradition. Mm-hmm. After all, we have I can think of 3 examples on the top of my head, and maybe there are more. But in the Bible itself, the Bible affirms 3 individuals, or there are 3 examples in the Bible of individuals outside of the tradition of faith, outside of those who worship the true God, those who actually opposed the true God, and yet God worked a miracle in their lives. So Balaam, the pagan prophet in Numbers 23, gives a prophecy, and we're told that he gives a prophecy of the Lord. The witch of Endor, who is a charlatan, if ever there was one, a necromancer, and Samuel appears to her after she calls upon the dead Samuel to appear. The actual Samuel appears to her, and she freaks out because she's like, okay, this is not what I'm used to. Kind of like a Whoopi Goldberg and Ghost, it's just like, okay, she's been deceiving these people for all these years, and now finally she encounters the real thing, and it kind of freaks her out. And then Jesus himself in Luke 11 speaks of, when he's accused of casting out demons by the power of Satan. He's accused, he turns that back on them, and he says, if I cast out demons by the power of Satan, who do your sons cast them out by? How are your sons? How are the Pharisees casting out demons? And I think Jesus is recognizing that exorcisms were taking place that he wasn't performing. Other people, even his own enemies, were performing exorcisms. And he seems to be recognizing that they were actually happening. Mm-hmm. And we could debate whether he was just using that as a rhetorical argument or whatever, but there's at least a possible interpretation of his words to say that he was recognizing those things as happening. So what if we had evidence that Buddha performed miracles? I mean, genuine evidence, eyewitness accounts, facts that are really hard to explain outside of the power of God. Why would I be, even though Buddha taught a worldview that I'm totally opposed to, why would I be opposed to the idea that God in his grace may have worked a miracle in the life of Buddha? And why God would do such a thing? Well, that's up to speculation, but I have no reason to think that he couldn't have done that. And I would just say to Bart Ehrman, look, you've given me really good evidence for the miracles of Baal Shem Tov. Why don't you believe them? Mm-hmm. I would just put it back on him. I say, you're making a pretty good case. I might have to go home and rethink this and think that maybe Baal Shem Tov performed miracles. Mm-hmm. What's wrong with? I don't know why a conservative Christian couldn't give such an answer. So,
especially since a conservative Christian recognizes that the Bible says that people who are against Christianity are going to perform signs, right?
Yes.
And they're going to try to take the elect away from Christianity. So if you're a conservative Christian, you believe that there are supernatural forces against Christianity who have done signs in the past and will do signs in the future.
Which does raise a question, doesn't it, Richard?
Mhm. Yes.
What do you say to someone like Tovia Singer? Tovia Singer says, even if Jesus was raised from the dead, I wouldn't believe, because that would just prove that he was a false prophet, because he taught things that were against the Jewish faith. And therefore, even if you proved to my satisfaction that he was raised from the dead, that would only convince me that someone like Satan raised him or something. I mean, that just because he was raised from the dead doesn't mean that God raised him from the dead.
A house divided cannot stand.
That's my answer. Yeah, go ahead.
Basically, like if Satan rose Jesus from the dead, then that means that Satan has been helping his enemy Yahweh become like the most worshipped guy around, all because of something he did.
Yeah, if Satan raised Jesus from the dead, it was his undoing. Is there any single person in human history that has led more people to the God of Israel than Jesus? I mean, I don't think there's even a close second. Mm-hmm. If you and I would be worshiping stones and sticks right now if it weren't for Jesus. We wouldn't be worshiping the living God of Israel. Who do we have to thank for that? We have Jesus to thank for that. I think that Ehrman would say, well, these are theological arguments you're giving. And I would say, yeah, that's fine. I mean, it's one thing for me to show that an event happened. It's another thing for me to give its cause. And I would take a few steps in this. I would say the resurrection is the best explanation of the known facts. And then the question is, who caused the resurrection? And that's where I get into philosophy, a philosophical theology. And I would just go down the possibilities. For example, if it was an angel, it's either a good angel or a bad angel, an angel for God or against God. Well, if it's a good angel, that means he was going by God's orders to raise Jesus from the dead, in which case I still have a miracle of God. If it's a bad angel, then it was to his undoing because he was opposed to God, and yet the resurrection of Jesus has led more people to God than any other event in history. If it was an alien, that doesn't seem likely. I mean, we don't even know aliens exist, but even if they did, are they going to fly 30,000 light years or more to this off-water planet and, I don't know, play a trick on the human race by raising a man from the dead? I just find that implausible in the extreme.
Yeah, then you're getting into arguments where there just isn't any evidence. You're just making things up, right?
Sure.
And Ehrman may say we don't have any historical evidence. I think he's wrong about that. I think he's mislabeling sources.
Yeah.
And we'll get to that. I assume we're going to eventually talk about that part of the debate.
Sure.
But so when you're just making up things whole cloth, that's not convincing, right?
Yeah, I had a student today ask me this question. She says, a couple of nuns told her a few years ago that Jesus basically just smoked a lot of pot and got high with people, and he kind of healed through sort of medicinal means like that.
And I asked, told her that?
Then apparently a group of nuns, a nun or a group of nuns, told my student this. And I said, well, what was their evidence? What was their data? Gary Habermas is really effective at that. In his debates, he has often looked at his opponents and well, your data is, I mean, you can't just come up with just any old thing, some logical possibility and say that's more plausible than that the resurrection happened. And he tells this funny story one time where, this is Gary Habermas, he was in a debate with a New Ager, and the New Ager said that Jesus was Venetian, not from the city of Venice, but from the planet Venus. He was from the planet Venus. And Habermas said, well, what is your data for that? And she said, well, all the pictures we have of Jesus, he's got blonde hair and blue eyes. And all Venetians have blonde hair and blue eyes. That was her data. Now, that was in the late 70s, early 80s. We've since learned that Venus has a runaway greenhouse effect and lightning strikes the surface just every couple of seconds. So we're pretty sure there's no life on Venus, and therefore we've pretty much ruled that hypothesis out. But her reasoning obviously is just even too laughable to refute. But this is, again, if you're just dead set on not believing, you can come up with anything. Now, luckily, Ehrman has a thought out position, and unfortunately, the guy on our side was not able to defeat him.
The thing that gets me is Ehrman gives Bass multiple chances to bring in his sources, and Bass never takes him up on it.
Right.
He never tries to take him up on, like, okay, let's actually look at the New Testament. He just says, "Oh, you agree that they witnessed this?"
Yeah.
And then Ehrman is like, "Well, what evidence do we have that they're telling the truth?" And then Bass never actually goes into the New Testament and says, "This is the evidence that we have."
Right. It was, well, anyway, we're about to get into the most embarrassing part of the argument, and we're going to have to talk about this, and then we'll have to close up shop. But
It is, if you come to believe that Jesus has been raised from the dead physically, it's quite likely you will become a Christian. So
and if you
inevitably
believe the miracles of Baal Shem Tov, then you become a Hasidic Jew.
And I'll also point out
So that is an evidence that Baal Shem Tov really did these things because somebody believes and then converts. It's not evidence.
And I would also add that there are scholars that I appreciate, people like E.P. Sanders. I know you respect E.P. Sanders. Like in Jesus and Judaism, the way he ends is basically saying, I don't know what happened.
Yeah.
But he admits the evidence is pretty strong.
There's
There's people that admit the evidence is strong, but they still
I guess
don't go all the way.
I guess my question
I
is,
think the evidence though is strong. I don't
if-
think
if you-
Well, you haven't cited any all you cited so far are eyewitnesses.
I mean,
And you've agreed that eyewitnesses in other cases don't work for you,
and just
including Baal Shem Tov. And so I'd like to know, why do you choose some eyewitnesses over others?
again, nobody. This goes back to Moroni. Nobody outside of those few people believe Moroni appeared to them. Nobody outside of certain Hasidic Jews believe that Baal Shem Tov did miracles.
How about Mormons?
How about Christians?
How about Mormons?
I just said nobody believes those miraculous claims happen outside.
Yes. Well, nobody outside of the Christian faith thinks that Jesus is the Son of God who was raised from the dead.
No. But people like Paul, for example, is an enemy that got convinced that Jesus rose from the dead. Who is the Paul for Baal Shem Tov? Tell me who he is.
Well, there are a lot of Hasidic Jews who didn't start out as Hasidic Jews who read these stories.
But who's a Paul? Who's someone who was persecuting the Hasidic Jews and then got convinced by the Baal Shem Tov miracles? You bring all these people up, but it's insane. I mean, Jesus is completely unparalleled, completely different than all these.
You are a Christian. You've always been a Christian. Of course, you think that Jesus is the greatest thing ever. And so I
almost said that you think Jesus is the most compassionate, the most influential, amazing person. You've said
I don't
that
think
he's
he's
close
most
to that.
compassionate. No, I don't. But so you're in the Christian tradition, and you want to show that you're right. And and so okay,
I want to just demonstrate that Jesus is
not doing this as a historian.
Died for our sins, and I want people to know that.
Exactly, you're a theologian, and that's fine. I have no qualms with you as a theologian. What I have qualms with is you claiming that you're doing this on disinterested historical ground.
Religion. If it didn't happen in history, it didn't.
But if you're going to be a historian, you have to treat every religion equally,
and if
not
you're going to
giving superiority to your particular.
But if you're going to be a historian, you need to be open-minded to miracles.
You're open-minded to everything.
No,
I am open-minded. Yes, if you can show,
you said that the physics can't be.
I did say that. I
defied.
No, you didn't hear me.
Okay.
I said you're saying it happened once in the entire human race. How many people have lived? I don't know how many people have lived on billions of people.
Mm-hmm.
There are 8 billion people alive today. None of them is going to rise from the dead. How many people have risen from the dead in your judgment? 1 out of 20 billion who lived or something. How many people have mistaken something they've seen? How many people have had a dream that they thought was something that was real? How many people have had a vision of a deceased loved one afterwards? Millions.
Right.
I mean, this is basically Hume's argument, isn't it? Against miracles. Essentially,
so I'm different from Hume. I'm not saying that it didn't happen. I'm saying that if you're
saying a historian can discover miracles in history, then you are saying.
Oh, I wish you wouldn't put words in my lips.
Okay, I do have to comment on this.
Mm-hmm.
And Bass apparently hasn't read Hume or didn't think to jump in. Hume never said that miracles can't happen. This is what makes Hume's argument so genius. Hume said it's never rational to believe that a miracle happened, because every time an extraordinary event happens, you have a choice. Did it happen, which is possible, or did someone lie about it? I've witnessed people lying all the time. I've never witnessed a miracle. Therefore, it is more rational for me to believe that I'm being lied to. That's, in a nutshell, Hume's argument. And so it's a very clever argument that the philosophers have. It stumps a lot of philosophers. And Hume does a two-pronged attack on the Christian worldview. He removes the natural theology from the Christian. He actually has a dialogue called the Dialogues on Natural Religion, where he decimates the arguments for God's existence. Kant will come along later and add further insult to those arguments. So this two-pronged attack of Hume and Kant it put the Christian theologians of the day back on their heels. Okay. And then right on the trail of this, he writes his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, where in there he questions a lot of things, and he has an essay called Of Miracles, where he gives this basic argument that I briefly summarized. That's what Hume is saying. Now, Ehrman is basically saying what Hume is saying. Ehrman is saying it's possible that the laws of physics could go out of their course. Hume used the word nature. It's possible that nature could go out of her course. But millions and millions and millions and millions of people have seen things that they were mistaken about. Millions and millions and millions of people have thought that something supernatural happened. It wasn't supernatural. So here comes along a guy named the Apostle Paul or Peter, whoever, and they say they saw Jesus. What's more likely? They were sincerely mistaken, or that they were lying, or that Jesus actually rose from the dead, that God intervened into history, 1 out of a billion, and raised Jesus from the dead. The two first options are far more plausible if we have no reason to think there's a God, and if the New Testament is not all that reliable, and all of that. If agnosticism is true, then the case for the resurrection is done for. So, we've been going for over an hour, or we're getting up to it. When all is said and done, I think that we were on somewhere between 55 minutes and an hour. So it may be good for us to just postpone our discussion until next week. The mind can only accept what the seat can endure. So, but do you have anything to say before we do close out? Before we'll pick this up next week.
Well, I think the really big, there's a lot of problems with the way Bass approaches this debate, but the really big problem he has is he's not really answering Bart Ehrman's questions ever. Right? Bart is asking, okay, well, why do you believe that they are right when they say this? Why do you think that he saw? And he doesn't answer it except to say, and I assume this is part of why this is one of the more embarrassing parts of the debate. It gets, the most embarrassing argument begins here, that it's just so special.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that next week, but the most embarrassing part of the debate is what comes next, where Bass leaves history altogether and doesn't seem to appreciate what Ehrman is saying, to wit, you've left history altogether. So, well, look, Richard, it was a pleasure being with you, and I'm glad we're back doing this, and we are going to get into a harmony of the life of Jesus based on a harmony I've written. The whole point of me writing the harmony was to show that the Gospels do not contradict one another. And I think it is an important part of an overall case for the reliability of the Scriptures. But we are going to spend a few weeks just assessing some of these critics of the argument for the resurrection. And anyway, I will continue researching that before we start the presentation. But I want to thank you for joining me. It's been a pleasant discussion, and
Always a pleasure.
and so and I just want to say to those of you that listened, I want to thank you for listening to our program today. If you liked what you heard, you liked the assessment, please just remember that we were not attacking Bass personally. He is a brother in Christ, but we were very disappointed in the arguments he laid out for the resurrection. I think that defenders of the resurrection can do a little better. And if you were blessed by this and you thought that we had insights here, please hit the subscribe button below. Please like us. It helps us out. And join us next week as we bring you Consider This, our Let's Get Scriptural series. Thank you.